Hello and what's up, political peeps? Per usual, I am your host, Arif Kapoor, and today I am joined by a Connecticut State Representative from the 88th State House District here in Connecticut, Deputy Speaker of the Connecticut House of Representatives, a little bit more relevantly, though, gubernatorial candidate here in Connecticut, Josh Elliott. Welcome to the Geopolitical.
Hey, Arif, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited, to have you on. You have a really unique, exciting race. This is the first time that an incumbent governor has faced a primary challenge since 1978 in Connecticut. So you're in a really unique position, and I'm really excited to share your story. So before we dive into kind of the ideology that you're running on, the platform and issues that you're targeting, to zoom way back in 2016, you first ran to represent Hamden in the Connecticut House of Representatives. Can you tell us a little bit more about what brought you to the political stage here in Connecticut?
Sure. So I didn't grow up in a political household, and it wasn't until college that I started having a sense that I was probably a Democrat. This was the Bush years, the years of the Florida decision, hanging Chad, the Iraq War, all of that. And then after I graduated college, I got really engaged by the Barack Obama campaign. And I ended up paying attention. But again, I didn't really know what being political meant. So a friend of mine who was actually working on the Hillary Clinton campaign, he had come up to Ithaca, where I was living at the time, and we started talking politics. And in 2009, I ended up moving down to Virginia Beach to work on a campaign that he was managing. And so that was the first time I got really active in the campaign side of politics. But then I moved back to Connecticut, was totally unengaged for about 6 years, and then re-engaged with the Bernie Sanders campaign because he was talking about things like the growing divide between the ultra-wealthy and everybody else, talking about dark money in politics. And this was a campaign that I wanted to get involved in. And so after about a year of being engaged at that level as a super volunteer, I was then approached by the Working Families Party, who asked me if I would challenge the Speaker of the House from the left. They wanted somebody who was going to be really vocal on a couple things, on increasing the minimum wage, on implementing paid family and medical leave. And because I'm a small business owner, and you don't have a lot of small business owners that are talking about these things because they're generally seen as being against economic interest, I just know that by building up a middle class, that it's in everybody's economic interest. And so I ended up pushing the Speaker of the House into early retirement. I lost my convention 18-3. I had to get signatures to get onto the ballot. I had 3 months to prove my case to the people in the district, and we ended up winning against somebody who had been involved in local politics for about 20 years. He had been, at one point, acting mayor for about 9 months, and we were able to win 60-40 because I worked hard, sure, but we also had a really strong team of people that worked hard. Labor came out and helped, and so we went from 0 to 60 very quickly, and here we are 10 years later.
Well, I think it's definitely a cause that really energizes people. And you can really rally people. I think we saw that, like you're describing, back in 2016 when you ran, and again at the Democratic convention, which it was an epic day, and I think you could see the support and passion from your people. I got to attend. It was my first ever state convention. It was a really cool experience. In 2022, you also ran for statewide office. You ran to be the Secretary of the State of Connecticut. You didn't make it onto the primary ballot, but right. I know that I've heard from people that it was a dramatic showdown at the 2022 convention. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So in that race, I announced sometime in August, September, whereas this time around, it was closer to, I think, mid-July is when I announced last year. These things really take a couple years. And so it would have been we didn't know what Ned Lamont was doing and what the lay of the land was going to be, and I was in session, so I pushed it back to after session. But when I announced in 2021 that I was running and had a lot of conversations, it was pretty clear to me out the gate that there was not a lot of appetite for a man in the role of Secretary of the State. And I still wanted for that race to use it as an opportunity because you never know what relationships you're going to build, what connects and what doesn't. And there were some really strong competitors. There's Representative Hilda Santiago out of Meriden, who was considered a strong front runner to start. There was Representative Matt Lesser at the time before he was senator, or maybe he was senator at that point, but he was either rep or senator, who was considered a front runner at the point. And then there was Representative Stephanie Thomas, who won, but she was a new representative, so people didn't expect her really to get that far. And then you had Maritza Bond out of New Haven, who does the health district there. So there was 5 of us. And I had never raised more than $5,000 because that's how much we have to raise for state rep seats. And so we had to raise $75,000 to $80,000, a number that I just didn't know if that was actually going to be possible. Didn't know really a lot of chairs around the state. I didn't know the process. And so I really learned a lot on that campaign about the process of running for a statewide, because there's a lot to know, a lot of people to know, and you have to understand how a run works mechanically. And I didn't have a lot of money to spend. And I raised, I think, $45,000 over the course of that campaign. Paid for some staff to help me out over the course of that race. You have to get 15% to be on the ballot. I think I got to like 13.5%. Now, there's a universe where I could have worked really, really hard to get that 15%, but it was so clear that I would just eke by. It was very unclear if I would really make that money. I was able to talk about the things I really cared about, which was ranked choice voting, which was 2 weeks of early voting. And I'll say at the time, 2 weeks of early voting was put me as a major outlier. All 4 other candidates were talking about the weekend before, and they all thought that 2 weeks was too much. Most of the party thought that 2 weeks was too much. And I spent a year or 8 months really talking with individual members of the Democratic Party about how 2 weeks was actually really normal for most states that have done this successfully. And so I was able to plant those seeds, and then years later, we become a state that has 2 weeks of early voting. And then the third thing of those 3 things was voting rights for people who are incarcerated. So I was happy to make it about issues. And when I didn't make it onto the ballot, I was able to move my support, as much as people wanted to listen, to Stephanie Thomas. And I was able to back the winner. And everything that I wanted to happen happened. It would have been great to have won, sure. But at the same time, you don't win every single time you try. You take losses in politics, and you have to get used to taking those losses, because that's just part of the fight.
Yeah, and then that brings us to today, which you mentioned. This is your second time, running in a statewide campaign. You started a little bit earlier this time around. Back in last summer, you declared your candidacy for governor. Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, it's a super unique race, super unique situation that you're challenging a sitting governor for a Democratic primary within the party. Tell me a little bit about where we are with the campaign. We were just talking about this a little bit offline beforehand. How you guys are waiting because Connecticut has really great public financing system. Just for some context to the audience, you guys are waiting to get your grant. Where's the campaign at right now? 1 month out from the August 11th primary.
We had to overcome 2 barriers to be considered, I wouldn't even say a competitive race, but a race that had any kind of chance. That is, we had to get onto the ballot. If you literally can't vote for me, then there's no race. And we had to raise the money, because without the resources, you can't reach enough people. Now, 60% of Democratic primary voters choose who they're going to vote for in the last 4 weeks. And we are about 5 weeks out right now. So we're not even in that window yet. we need the resources to push ads, to create ads, to put them on cable and digital and broadcasts, linear. There's so many different places. Of course, we have yard signs out and we have literature and things like that and people knocking doors, but you need to spend a lot of money on advertising. So to get onto the ballot, we had to get 15% of the delegates that go to the state convention. And these are Democrats from around the state who hold the reins of power and determine who is going to access the ballot. And you have maybe a couple people from smaller towns up to 70 or 80 people in the bigger cities. So there's a range depending on how densely populated and how Democratic voter turnout is in these places. So around 2,000 people went to the convention in May, which meant that a lot of my campaign was driving around the state and talking to Democratic town committees, of which there's 169, and I went to about 136 of them. And I talked to the chairs and I talked with the members about what I would like to see for our state. And I answered questions and I tried to be as accessible and continue to be as accessible as possible. So when people have questions about what I want to do, I'm available. And we soared past that number. We're still running against an incumbent, which means that some people have an allegiance to the person who's there. So we got 25%. And if we didn't, we would have needed over 10,000, 15,000, 18,000 signatures. It would have been an incredibly high bar to force that primary. But we didn't need to because we convinced enough people that this was a candidacy worth supporting. And then the other side is the money side. Now, Ned Lamont makes $55 million a year in passive generational banking income. This is a person who has spent $70 million of his own money to ultimately purchase the seat. And we don't have that kind of money. So we need to rely on the program that the state has created for people like me to be able to run for office, where I needed to raise either $250,000 or $335,000, because the way the law is written is that earlier this year, if I raised the money before mid-January, it was $250,000. So Aaron Stewart, Ryan Fazio, when they raised their money, they raised $250,000. We had to raise $335,000 because it went up by an inflationary amount. No candidate in the history of this program has raised that inflationary amount. We are the first candidacy to do so. So we raised somewhere between thank you. We raised somewhere between $350,000 to $355,000. And what that does is it makes us eligible for a $3.75 million grant. And we're going to find out in about 2.5 hours whether or not we get that grant. And every sign points to us getting it. The reason this program is so good is because it came from people that gave at least $5, but no more than $340. So it's just normal people, thousands of normal people across the state that said, we want an option in terms of who we vote for in August. And what I'll say finally here is that in August of last year, I think I raised $6,000. In September of last year, I think I raised $7,000. But in the month of May alone, I raised about $100,000. So these things take time. And there was a sense of, if I'm not Mom Donnie in a week, and if we don't have all this money in a month, then it's just going to be a failure. But I know that politics is slow and that you need to spend time talking with people individually to bring them on board a shared vision and a shared mission, so that by the time we got to the convention and we were getting closer and closer to deadline, people saw that we were still in this race and they really wanted to help out. And we really grew something and are continuing to grow something that is tangible and substantial. And which is why I feel good about going into this last month, heading into the August election.
And, so I think now that you're getting the money, hopefully, since this is a real-time coverage right here, we're going to find out in a couple hours whether or not you guys get that grant. It seems like the biggest thing, I've been working on different state level races for state senate and state house, canvassing across the state now for the past couple months. State level campaigns are kicking off. I go to the doors and I talk to people, and if people ask about the August 11th primary, people know who Ned Lamont is, right? So I think the
Mhm.
biggest thing that you can spend this almost $4 million on is to make sure that they also know who Josh Elliott is, because
Exactly.
whether or not you support taxing the rich or you support all the things that you want to fight for, people should know who you are and really have that second option.
Exactly right.
So you mentioned just now Zohran Mamdani, and I think it's hard to not compare you to Zohran Mamdani, right? You're a younger guy in the New York mayoral primary. He was facing also an older guy. You're charismatic, Josh Elliott, and you know you're going into this race with a disadvantage. You watch those videos back before Mamdani really took off. He was on the street corner and people were walking by him, and then a couple of weeks after that, people were surrounding him as he walked down the street. Do you compare yourself to Zohran Mamdani at all, or is that just everybody else?
What I will say is my hesitance in comparing myself is that Zoran is incredibly charismatic, incredibly intelligent, and it just seems like everything he says is so well conceived and thought out. And so that's a high bar. And for me to say that I'm like that feels a little too much like I'm patting my own back. I think I have strengths. I know what those strengths are. I'm really great one-on-one. I really like connecting with people. I love hearing people and listening to people. I love figuring out how to solve people's problems. And I would say I'm okay talking to big groups. I'm passionate about the work. I would say that we align on policy, certainly. And I strive to be, and I strive to have this campaign be as strong as that campaign and as that candidacy. Whenever there are analogies made, I'm complimented. I am not going to be the one to make those analogies. I will say that because of how strong that campaign was, we have brought on some of the consultants that worked on that campaign to help work with this campaign, create our ads and do some of our polling and guide that way. A lot of the things that we're talking about are things that I've been working on for a decade. So no one's coming into this campaign and changing the vision or changing the mission. But in terms of how we present, in terms of best practices, there are a lot of things that I don't know how to work with television stations. I don't have the team to put together a really amazing script and a really amazing ad. And this is what we've tapped into from that campaign. So I try to learn from everybody around me, both the good and the bad. And I think that there was a lot of good to learn from the Mamdani campaign.
And I think, for better or for worse, the elephant in the room whenever you compare campaign to Zohran Mamdani's campaign is that Zohran's a self-proclaimed democratic socialist. He believes in socialism, but in the past, you've told people not to call you a socialist, despite, like you mentioned, using this Mamdani's consultants and, celebrating and advocating for many of the items that democratic socialists who won federal elections in New York last month, or Zohran Mamdani advocate for. Why not call yourself a socialist? And would you condemn socialism if we're coming into America?
I don't condemn socialism. I don't condemn democratic socialism. I think that there's a place for dialogue, especially how we organize ourselves. There's certainly some things I do condemn, and we see fascism coming out of our federal government right now, and that is something that I would condemn. But what we see is a lot of sewer socialism, which is just people making sure who get elected that the trains run on time and that people's basic needs are met. I don't see anything there to condemn. And given that we generally, as Americans, view some of the strongest that we've been economically, came at the end of World War II until the 80s. And this was a time when we taxed the wealthy at marginal tax rates of 94 and 92% for a few years. It was 70% for decades and decades. And we act as though if we ask the wealthy to pay in to represent the fact that they've been able to make this money and be this successful because of decades worth of investment made before them, I think that the premise of democratic socialism is that people should have the choice through a democratic model to come together to work towards an economic model where we are protecting people. I consider myself as a title an economic populist. I will say that in terms of policy, there's not a lot of differentiation between being a democratic socialist and an economic populist. It's just a title that I personally carry for myself. And I align myself with democratic socialists plenty. So it is not something that I would in any way demean. And I think that there's room for this conversation all around.
And I think you really illustrate that there's a difference between Russian communism, socialism, or socialism that we've seen across the world that's killed like hundreds of millions of people because of tyrannical regimes, versus you're making trains run faster and taxing the rich a little bit more in New York City, right? At the same time, that's how it starts, right? It can be a slippery slope.
Sure. I mean, it can be a slip.
If you're taxing the rich, right? How do you prevent? How do you make sure that we don't go down the wrong path if you're elected governor?
I mean, it's just through democratic means. I mean, through any sort of political infrastructure, you can have perversion. We have perversion now. What we're seeing is perversion. And it is using the tools of government to basically treat people as though they are less than human. Also not good. Right. We have a capitalistic model where people are dying of starvation when we have some of the greatest wealth that our country has ever seen. When we have people that are working 40, 60, 80 hours a week and still have to live in their cars because they can't afford a home. So through any model, economic or political, you're going to have potentially perversion. You'll have perversion. Important to look at the outcomes of all these models of where you're at any point in time and see how and why those things are happening. My perspective is that we are at a point in time where there's not enough regulation for the things where we have bad outcomes. Not for everything across the board. There's some places where we might have too much regulation, but for things like housing, when you say too much regulation, I would say two things. I would say we have too much regulation at the local level and not enough regulation at the state level to limit the regulation at the local level so that people can do what they want to do with their property. That's an example of, you can't just say there's too much or too little regulation. It depends on what level, depends on what the thing is, it depends on what we're talking about. And what I think people should be concerned about is too much power in any one place, whether it's too much power in the hands of our energy monopolies, too much power in government, sure. That's why we have a legislature and a judiciary and an executive branch. But there's going to be too much power in the private sphere as well, where there is regulatory capture, where there is labor crushing and union crushing. Right now, we have less union membership than we've had in a very, very long time. So yes, any system can potentially go off the rails. And it's important to have an educated constituency to ameliorate the worst effects of when that happens.
And it's important, and I appreciate that you acknowledge that any government. It's important to acknowledge any government system is dangerous and susceptible to people who aren't well intentioned, and obviously,
absolutely,
capitalism is what America was founded upon. So I think it's also important that you don't call yourself a socialist, which you know, I think it keeps you more mainstream.
Yeah.
Now, just to dive specifically into one of the biggest things that you've stood for on your campaign, which is to
Mhm.
tax the rich. Now,
Yeah.
Connecticut, a recent study came out, is the state in the U.S. with the most wealth inequality out of any of the other 49 states. And in Connecticut, the top billionaires pay only 8% of the state and local taxes in the state. That
Mhm.
obviously seems like an issue. Why is taxing the rich so important?
So the statistic that I use is that the top 4,500 income earners in our state pay less than 8% of their income to state and local taxes. While the bottom 1.2 million income earners, that is a third of our state, pay over 20% of their income to state and local taxes. A differential of at least 2.5 to 1. The reason for this is that we over rely on the property tax to fund essential services. This is things like police and fire, local transportation, public works, but most importantly to me, the education system that we have in our state, which means that we have created a system where the investment that we holistically make in people's education is going to depend on the zip code they grew up in. And in some places, we're going to weigh more heavily on others. And we weigh more heavily on middle class workers, on the working class. And the reason for that is that a property tax is a middle class wealth tax. It's not an ultra wealthy wealth tax because the ultra wealthy don't have their money stored in their homes the way that people in the middle class do. We are taxing almost all the wealth of middle class earners. You couple that with the fact that because the state doesn't send enough money back to municipalities, you'll have Greenwich as an example, which has a mill rate of 11. This is the headspace that the governor comes from. Hamden has a mill rate of 53. So you take what is on its face a bad tax and you make it so much worse by the fact that every town is doing this alone. The reason I believe in asking the wealthy to pay more is not just to raise more money. I do believe that we can and we should be providing more services. And when I say more services, I'm talking about like trains. I'm talking about buses. I'm talking about affordable housing. I'm not talking about like SNAP, which we should be backfilling. And I'm not talking about even health insurance, which we should be creating a public option. I'm even just talking about real basic stuff about moving people around and making sure people have roofs over their heads. What I'm saying is follow the model of what Massachusetts just did a few years ago, where they implemented a 4% surcharge on people making $1 million or more. Is this going to change everything dramatically overnight for us? No. Will this help incredibly? It will. It'll bring in a few $billions a year for us to be making the investments that we need. Some of this will go back to our municipalities to help fund our education system. Some of this will go into our transportation system to make sure that we have more options and more locations for our trains. This will go into affordable housing to ensure that we have more public housing available for people. There are so many big problems here in Connecticut that we've basically stuck our heads in the sand and said there's nothing that we can do. All the while, last year, H.R. 1, which was the federal budget bill that passed last year, $1.5 trillion with a T, $1 trillion giveaway to people making $1 billion or more. And a lot of those are millionaires and billionaires. A lot of those people live here disproportionately in our state. And this cost of $1.5 trillion came from our social safety net, from the people who need the help the most. We are continuing to funnel resources up. And there's this whole big thing about socialism being, taking money from the rich and giving to the poor. We've been taking money from the middle class and shoving it upwards for decades. And you have to just see who gets taxed how much to know that this is just fact and that it doesn't work. It's not a system that works.
Yes, Josh, and I know that you have to go in just 1 minute, so I only have one more question for you.
Sure.
A lot of people argue. I run a debate club at school, among fellow middle schoolers, where we talk, and the topic that was brought up is socialism and taxing the rich. We were actually talking about your candidacy and your race. I was telling
Cool.
them how amazing it was that we met on May 16th, and how
Yeah.
like charismatic you were, like as a new voice for the
hmm
office of the governor. And these kids asked me, so Arv, what is socialism? What does it mean to tax the rich? And we started talking about it. And the point that we brought up as a group, about 10 of us, was
hmm
that well, taxing the rich obviously fixes many of the things that you just mentioned. Doesn't being rich and working hard and building big companies that obviously create wealth inequality in the state, doesn't that drive ambition? Isn't that the American dream? And at the same time, doesn't that create jobs? So you could argue that people who have these big corporations are already employing so many people. They're already giving so much back to the state. They're making the iPhones, the computers, right? Shouldn't they pay less taxes?
If we do that, what we are killing are other people's opportunity. Because what provides a scenario for people to become that successful is investment in infrastructure. That when you're talking about Elon Musk, our first trillionaire, how did he get so successful? By massive government grants. Massive. This wasn't a thing he just did on his own. He got a ton of government money. Bezos, all these Amazon warehouses, getting tons of carve-outs from places where they go, where they don't have to pay property tax. Yes, it is great that people are successful, and we should celebrate that. We should always remember, nobody does this alone. We all do it together. And an idea that a CEO should make 1,000 times more than the frontline worker, that they're doing that much more. There's only so many hours in the day. It used to be culturally that a CEO would make 10, 15 times more than the average worker would. Because the privilege is being in that position to lead the organization. And it's not that we shouldn't celebrate people who are successful. We should. But we should do it commensurately. Otherwise, we have an economic model that's broken. And when people graduate college and they have decades worth of debt and they can't afford a home and they can't afford a family and they can't afford to put food on the table, that is how you get fascism. Because people need somebody to blame when they're doing everything right. We had built an economic model 50, 60 years ago where you could go to college for free. You could afford a home in your mid-20s. And we think of these things as being impossible and impossible to do again. It's not impossible to do again. The reason they were able to do that was they had the ultra wealthy reinvest in an infrastructure that allowed them to become wealthy in the first place. There's this mentality that we're all frontiers people and that we're all doing this on our own. We are not. We are all doing this together. And there needs to be a recognition in the tax code that we want to make life good for the people ahead of us. And right now, we are just making it harder for the people ahead of us. And it's time for the pendulum to swing back.
Right. So it's that perfect balance between, allowing wealthy people to have ambition and allowing new ideas to come to the United States, and then, making sure that we continue propping up new people the same way we prop up, others. All right, Josh,
Yes.
I know you got to run. Thank you so much for your time. This was incredible.
Of course.
It was so good to learn more about you, learn more about the race. Best of luck. The clock's ticking, 2 more hours.
A pleasure.
On our live coverage of your citizens election program, Grant. It was truly a pleasure, Josh. Best of luck, and
Thank you,
thanks for tuning in.